Hundreds of children still remain separated from their parents, according to new court documents filed by the Trump administration. Of the 2,654 children separated from their families at the U.S.-Mexico border, 497 remain in the government's care. Parents of 322 of those children have already been deported. The administration said the parents of 167 children gave up the right to reunification. However, the ACLU strongly disputes that claim, saying some parents may have been coerced or misled. Meanwhile, congressional Democrats are calling for a hearing over reports the Trump administration is questioning the citizenship of hundreds, possibly thousands, of Hispanic Americans along the southern border and denying them passports. The Washington Post reports that the government is denying passports to people with U.S. birth certificates in South Texas, alleging that decades ago, midwives and some doctors in the region provided fraudulent birth certificates to babies who were born in Mexico. State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert responded to the report, tweeting, "The truth is, domestic passport denials for so-called midwife cases have actually decreased during the Trump administration." The department has declined to provide information to the Post about the number of people it has denied passports due to questions surrounding fraudulent birth certificates. Joining us now, member of the Foreign Affairs and Intelligence Committees, Democratic Congressman Joaquin Castro of Texas. Good to have you on board.
Thanks for having me.
Where do we begin? I guess I'll start with the children who are separated from their families that have been deported or who have somehow given up their rights, which I question that in many different ways, how that actually transpired. What can be done to fix this damage that has been done? Anything?
Well, you're right. I mean, this is a humanitarian crisis. It's tragic.
Yes.
The Trump administration started separating young kids from their parents with no plans to reunify them. And that's what makes this especially cruel. Some of these kids are very young, and they've now been there for months and months. What we need to do now, what the judge should do now in this case, is take it out of the hands of the Trump administration and appoint a special master or a committee of special masters who are empowered to use all of the government's resources to reunify those kids with their parents and to go find the parents who've been deported and reunite them with their kids.
Can the president do something like that? Can he appoint somebody and a committee to try and, I mean, this is going to be a very difficult task to try and reunite these children.
Or the president could appoint essentially what amounts to a special master. But the problem is, as we've seen, the president, this is just not a priority for him. This is not something that he's thought a lot about, I don't think. And so it's going to take, I think, the court, a judge in this case, to come in there and say to Health and Human Services and to ICE, I'm taking this out of your control. I'm giving it to somebody outside of the government to make sure that it gets done. That, I think, is the best course of action at this point.
And then what do you make of these reports about the passports being denied? Has this been happening in the past? Is there a legitimate reason for it, the midwife cases? Or is this more of the Trump administration cracking down in a way that no presidency has seen?
Well, the reason that the Washington Post story that came out, I think, 2 days ago was so troubling is because, look, of course, the president and his administration have gone after undocumented immigrants, including dreamers who have been here a long time, but also have gone after legal residents and trying to limit the number of legal residents in the United States. And then there was reporting over the last year about Stephen Miller trying to form a group of people to go scrub the citizenship records and applications of naturalized citizens. So when the Washington Post report comes out saying that the Trump administration is now denying the full rights of citizenship, including passports, to Hispanics in South Texas, of course it's going to raise alarms. I heard the quote that the State Department gave That's not exactly what they told our office yesterday. They couldn't give us specific numbers on how many people have been affected. And yes, this has been a problem in the past. In the 1950s, there was an operation called Operation Wetback that rounded up a bunch of Mexican nationals who'd been brought here to be part of the labor force in the 1940s and 50s. But in that roundup, there were a lot of Americans, Mexican Americans, who were caught up in that and summarily deported. It was also a problem later, so much so that in 2009, the Obama administration actually tried to stop the practice of denying these passports, and it looks like the Trump administration may be starting it up again.
Yeah, the Post reports, Congressman, that both George W. Bush and Barack Obama did deny passports, some of these midwife passports. I want to ask you more broadly, though, Congressman, how the issue of immigration and the Trump administration's approach to it is playing in the state of Texas. There's a big Senate race there between Beto O'Rourke and Ted Cruz, probably a little tighter than Ted Cruz hoped it would be or would like it to be. How big a deal is immigration and this administration's stance on immigration in that race and in your state?
I think it's playing a big role. And many Texans, most Texans, are dissatisfied with the Trump administration's position on immigration. And they're dissatisfied with Ted Cruz because Ted Cruz won't stand up to Donald Trump, even though time after time, not only on the issue of immigration, but also on NAFTA and on other issues, Donald Trump has done things that are hurting the state of Texas.
Congressman, it's Jonathan Lemire. I mean, how closely, what do you think about the children being separated? Let's go back to that for a moment. This has become, in many people's estimation, sort of a defining moral crisis of this administration. And it is one that is still continuing. We're now a couple of months in. You mentioned the president could step in the special master. There's more than Congress could be. But broader speaking, where do you think this stands about sort of the values of America right now? That this could still happen, this could still be persisting, and that we are still, even though we're a few weeks now from seeing these new images of children crying, being separated at their border, now they're being replaced by images of parents and children, even those who've been reunited, those children being changed, not recognizing their mother or father or feeling different. Where does that speak to us right now as about a nation?
Well, I mean, y'all know that the news cycle moves so fast now, but this story was on the news for about 6 weeks straight, which is remarkable in this era to be able to do that and to capture the nation's attention. And I think when most Americans saw what happened and the separation, especially of young kids, I went to 2 of these facilities and saw an 8-month-old baby, a boy, and a 1-year-old girl that were there without any family members, with no parents present. And I think people's reaction was, this is not America. This is not who we are, or shouldn't be who we are and what we stand for. And the challenge now is to make sure that those remaining kids that have been separated from their parents get reunited. But another challenge is, like I said, the media cycle moves so fast and there's so many legitimately important stories that come up, but we can't let this go. We can't allow 500 people, 500 kids to be permanently separated from their parents just because those parents were seeking asylum or were so desperate they felt that they needed to leave their home country to seek a better life and to protect themselves.
All right, Congressman Joaquin Castro joining us this morning from San Antonio. Thanks for your time, Congressman. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
We've got much more ahead this morning on Morning Joe, and some fun video for you as we go to break. A look at British Prime Minister Theresa May throwing down some dance moves yesterday in Kenya on a 3-day trip aimed at boosting Britain's trade with that country. Oh, boy, she really is getting down. This really, though, just an excuse for us to show President Bush.
Yes.
The members of a West African dance company in the Rose Garden in 2007.
I don't think we'll see President Trump dancing like this in any sort of fashion.
Somehow, and working the drums as well. Don't forget that. Morning Joe's coming right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.